RuneScape 3 players have been busy preparing for the upcoming Necromancy skill, launching on August 7th of this year. It's not the only RuneScape getting a new skill soon, however. The Old School RuneScape team has been giving players sneak peeks recently into the sailing skill in development right now. After taking a look at everything unveiled about this extremely complex skill so far, I found a ton of resemblances and straight up identical content that RuneScape 3 players have in player-owned ports. Which RuneScape will do it better, and will both RuneScapes benefit from this shared content? Let's check it out. Good day, everybody. It's no secret that the two RuneScapes have copied content over to each other since the game split many ages ago. Much of the time, it's Old School that picks up new content that was successful in RS3 and ports it over in a version that fits Old School. But many RuneScape 3 players might be surprised to learn that even Necromancy, and more or less a Necromancy spellbook, have existed in Old School for many years now. I want to talk about sailing and ports in this video because I think there's a really great opportunity for Jagex to test out different versions of what is actually my favorite minigame in RuneScape 3. If you can even call it a minigame, because the scope of player-owned ports is huge. Before I go more into my thoughts on that, though, let me walk you through all the parallels I see between player-owned ports of RS3 and sailing of Old School RuneScape as it stands so far. Many aspects of sailing having to do with the rewards of the skill were posted in an Old School news update in early July. This infographic here details the new islands and explorable parts of the world that we'll see introduced with sailing. At first glance, we can see quite a few islands that exist with a lot of content in RS3, such as Cyclosis and the homes of two elite dungeons, Aminishi and the Shadow Reef. Here we have a teaser for the new location players can find as they play through the skill, called the Great Conch. A new location, not the new location I should say, because there'll be a lot, but anyways. The big advertised appeal of this place is that it gives players new training methods for woodcutting, fletching, and slayer. Similar benefits were introduced in the Ark in RuneScape 3, which is closely tied in content to player-owned ports. Established islands within the Ark, as well as discoverable islands that are randomly generated, give players new methods to train these skills and many others. On Aminishi, a new Slayer training method was even introduced via contracts to kill disciples on the island and in the Elite Dungeon. Next, we have information on an array of new resources that can be gathered via sailing. It's specified here that these resources will be used internally and in the sailing skill to grant various benefits, and it looks like some of these materials can be used to craft new armors or teleport jewelry. Player ports have basically the same concept down to a T, just with fewer resources from the looks of it. Similarly, there are some materials that can be gathered and used only within your player port to upgrade your ship or your buildings. Other resources called trade goods can also be gathered, and these are used to make tradable things like armors, weapons, and scrimshaws to use outside of ports or to sell to other players to make some GP. The most notable difference between the ports and sailing approach is the number of resources projected in sailing. I'm curious as to whether this will be well received, as it makes for more content to play through, having more resources or types of, or if players will take it as overly complicated and wish there were fewer resources. Now, this graphic also shows us content and rewards from sailing that echo player ports, but this is much more exciting to me. Player-owned ports is an entirely interface-based minigame, meaning that although there is implied combat and navigating the seas and exploring uncharted waters, we don't directly see much of it. We have some dialogue as we progress through the stories of some ports adventurers, but otherwise, the visual scope of ports is limited to setting up your ship and crew through an interface and clicking set sail, and waiting some time for the voyage to be done, and then you just click to get your rewards. One thing we know about sailing is that although the exact mechanics are still in the works, you will be able to literally sail your ships, like drive them around, and actually engage in combat and exploration. The last I heard about this, they were deciding, or it's going to be in polls or something, of whether this will be like literally your WASD or your arrow keys or point and click like the rest of the game, or some other totally new type of navigation, which is really cool. It means that exploring uncharted waters could potentially be much more engaging and fun content than anything we have right now in either RuneScape. This graphic also hints at salvaging activities, which can reward the player with rare or useful items. This is similar conceptually to trade good voyages in ports, or the very rare voyages from the Tengu, for example, that will grant you rare rewards from ports that you can use outside of your port. Port tasks of sailing indicate that there will be activities that reward you directly with GP to spend in the rest of RuneScape, which would be a much needed and realistic improvement over the voyages available in player-owned ports. The process of monetizing your player port activities in RuneScape 3 into actual cash takes months to get going properly and is not that reliable. Barracuda trials here sound like a completely new way to obtain rare materials by completing challenges with a new type of gameplay, which sounds awesome and doesn't really have any equivalent in player ports that I can think of. And lastly on this page it mentions combat, which we're still in the dark on for the most part. This is also something that player-owned ports completely lacks. I would love for this aspect to be tested out in Old School via sailing and ported over to RS3 in an appropriate manner after a while. This graphic here gives a look at training methods for other skills that'll be available via sailing, namely fishing, farming, mining, and hunter. In RS3's ports, you do need at least level 90 in several skills to start engaging with the specific adventurers and their voyages, and you'll even have access to voyages that reward chunks of experience in their specific skills, but that's about the extent of it. As I mentioned before, the ARC introduced many new high-level training methods for a number of skills, but those methods aren't really dependent on progressing far in any like minigame or other skill to access. I'm going to look forward to seeing how these training methods pan out and whether better experience rates or the new resources will be the main focus. Next, we have some info on shipbuilding. This also looks more or less like it's taken from ports directly, as you have a few ships there and you can build upgrades to different parts progressively, like the sails and the hull and the cannons. What looks interesting here in sailing, though, is, and what I hope to see, is not just a linear progression of which upgrades you should get when you reach a certain sailing level. I see a lot more options for cannons, for example, that deal different types of damage. I'm hoping there will be a time and place for many of these cannons in different situations or different types of whatever missions, gameplay, challenges, etc. And that we don't just end up with all players having like the level 92 elite cannon here just because it's the highest level and therefore the most powerful. It's also indicated that you'll be able to use skills like construction, crafting, and smithing to build these upgrades, which is a different take than player-owned ports upgrades, in that those only rely on internal ports resources. The last infographic of this post deals with your crew, but to discuss that, I want to jump to a more recent news post that deals with the lore of the sailing skill. Here in this graphic, we can see that not only will we have generic crew members to hire, like in player-owned ports, but there will also be core RuneScape characters like Vanaka and Evil Dave somehow that we can unlock with specific requirements. In player ports, all the crew and captains you can hire are completely random and generic, so this is a big improvement in my mind and sounds like a much more fun way to do the same thing. Alright, I'm going to stop here for now. This lore news post is really interesting actually as well, but I think this video is long enough, and I want to finish my thoughts on the player ports of RS3 versus sailing. One of the most interesting things to me about comparing these is the reception by their respective player bases. I remember rumors of sailing circulating as far back as 7 years ago or so, which is roughly the last time I tried Old School, and I only stuck with it a few months, but I remember that this skill has been asked for by a large chunk of the player base for such a long time and is widely well received so far in its current stage of development. There was even a poll a few months ago that allowed players to vote for the next new skill between taming, shamanism, and sailing. JMods made entire video arguments for each skill and why it should be chosen, and all sounded like great expansions to Old School RuneScape in their own ways, but sailing still won out. It's amazing to me that the player base has been so excited for this for so many years, because as a whole, the RuneScape 3 player base does not feel that way about player-owned ports. I mentioned before that ports is my favorite minigame type activity within RuneScape, but there are tons of players who feel the exact opposite way. For many players, there is so much content to grasp and learn with ports that it's overwhelming and it's hard to get the hang of or to get any meaningful rewards from. One of my most popular guides on YouTube is for player-owned ports for this very reason. I think I did a good job of explaining it from the basics and keeping it simple, and I still couldn't get my guide any shorter than about an hour because there's so much to cover even at a basic level. Because of this, I think that sailing is actually in a very dangerous position in that if it overwhelms its players with too much new information at once, the same thing might happen, and it might just be kind of a largely discarded skill by a large chunk of the player base after it releases. The aforementioned lore post mentions a progression of several quests that will guide players through the skill gradually, which is great. There's also mention of existing quests like Bow and Voyage and Cabin Fever that are very sailing heavy. They'll be retroactively updated and inherit sailing skill mechanics instead of the janky mechanics that the quests currently use. This is also a huge step up from RuneScape 3's approach to this type of thing, by the way. For example, we got Archaeology some years ago, which is an absolutely incredible skill with amazing rewards and content to explore. But quests like the dig site remained untouched, so it's possible to have level 120 archaeology, be the Grand Master of the Archaeology Guild, and still have to do the dig site quest to take idiotic exams, so that they let you dig at even the crappiest plots, which of course use outdated mechanics. Anyways, to wrap up my thoughts on all this, I think that if sailing development stays on track the way it's going, it will be in a position to take all the best aspects of player-owned ports that it's clearly borrowing from, and make this type of content much more approachable and appreciable by the wider player base. It makes me a bit sad that other players don't like player ports as much as I do, because it's too much to dig into with relatively little guidance, and also that there are many aspects like ship combat and exploration of the whole world, sea, that we only ever see through single mouse clicks and some dialogues. I have been dipping into Old School RuneScape on a very new and newbie iron right now, but I am very excited for Sailing to be released because I think it's going to be a really great expansion of fun, exploratory content in a new and engaging way. And I honestly hope that player ports of RuneScape 3 gets a serious rework at some point because of the success that I hope Sailing will have. That's all I have to say on this for now. As mentioned, there's actually a lot of really interesting crossover content between RuneScape 3 and Old School RuneScape. Please leave your thoughts on ports, Sailing, and any other crossover content you enjoy or hope to see someday. If you enjoyed this video too and want to see more like this, as well as some helpful RuneScape 3 guides, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel as well. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you in the next one.